Hi, I'm Doug, your tech support representative here at Atlantic British. In this video, we're going to touch on something that we've had a lot of requests for in the past. It's a fairly common issue with some of these older 4.0 and 4.6s, and that's head gaskets. We've had a lot of our do-it-yourself technicians and a lot of shops have called me on different issues on these, but the biggest thing basically is usually head gaskets. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you basically a video on how to do that. So first I want to talk about the kit that you're going to need. Now, of course, you know, like on the 4.0 and the 4.6, as of 1999, they went from GEMS to BOSCH. So you need to be able to identify which engine you have in your vehicle before you even begin. And that you can get that information right off of our website. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you on a BOSCH, which is a little bit more complicated than the GEMS, so it might be a better one to be able to get into. So what I'm going to show you first is the gaskets kit that we have available. It comes all in one set and gives you all the gaskets that you're going to need to be able to do the whole head gasket job. Now this is under our part number STC4082BKA, and this is for the BOSCH engine. We do have one for the GEMS, so you'll need to be able to find that in the website. The other thing is, and because they normally recommend that you replace them with every head gasket job, is going to be head bolts. Now these are torque to yield head bolts, so the specification on these when you tighten them in is based on how many degrees you turn the bolt, and we'll get into that when we talk about reassembly. But this is the head bolt kit that you'll need. Now if you want to go one step better, we also have a stud kit available which will take the place of the head bolts. I find this is a more reliable setup, especially when you're dealing with aluminum engines because of the high expansion and contraction when they heat and cold. So this stud kit is also available through us, and we have this under ARP 4301. Both will work, the head bolts or the stud kit. It all depends on how you want to put your engine together. Alright, so before we even begin, I'll just give you a few tips that'll make the job a little bit easier for you. First off, right off the bat, obviously we're going to disconnect the battery, disconnect the negative lead, put that to the side. This way you know, as far as your alternator circuit and what, that it's not going to be live. You're not going to touch it and ground it out and cause any damage. So we're going to disconnect the battery. We're going to end up draining the coolant, which I'll show you a nice little trick because on these they don't have a drain plug at the bottom of the radiator. So I'll show you a nice little trick for getting that off. First thing we would do then, we would take off the fan shroud and the fan. And I have a habit of, I let the air out of the front tires, which gets the nose down by about 3.5 inches, what makes it a lot easier to get to the hardware and whatnot towards the back of the engine. The other thing you may want to do, if you're not that familiar with the design, this is the first time taking one apart, or you haven't done one before, it's a good idea to grab yourself empty coffee cans, little plastic containers or whatever, and then as you disassemble the engine, you're going to put that hardware from different segments in a container and you're going to mark it. Alternator hardware, valve cover hardware, and whatnot. So when you go to reassemble, it's a lot easier to identify what bolts go where. And then generally, last but not least, as I say, once we've lowered the front end, we disconnect the battery, we're going to drain the fluid, is bring your digital camera out or your smartphone when you get to an area where, like say for your belt configuration or for the way the wiring is routed on one side. Take a picture of it before you disassemble it. Believe me, it'll make it a lot easier when you go to reassemble. So those are some tips to help get you started. Now I'll show you how to drain the coolant. Alright, so we're going to start. We're going to remove the top of the fan shroud, and all you've got is 4 Phillips screws, and it's not even a full screw, it's a turn 90 degree and release. That'll pop this upper shroud off. We'll take the hose off, and then what we'll do is get down to the fan itself, and we'll take that off. So we remove the cover from the shroud. Now we're going to get into the fan. Now essentially I've pre-loosened this fan because with several different things you may run into. One, they may come off very easy, where you're going to take your fan tool, you're going to run it down on the nut, let it sit on there. You want to do this between the blades so that you're not going to crack a fan blade on this. And just take a nice rubber mallet or something with some weight, give it a quick shot. Now 50% of the time that'll just break them loose and allow you to take the fan off. But in this case we had one where we had a lot of problems, and you can do several different things. You can take a long straight blade screwdriver, sneak it behind the tool, and jam it between the water pump hub and one of the pulley bolts. There's also a tool available through Land Rover that is a long flat bar that will drop over and actually grab around all those bolts on the pulley and allow you to hold it and get some leverage. If you're in a shop, I know I've had to do it several times, is a long air chisel extension and then just work the nut and just slowly work it off. In this case, we had to basically turn this off almost all the way before it finally loosened up. So these can get on there pretty tight, so be prepared to spend some time on this if yours is in that condition. So once we've reached that point, we've been able to unthread it, and this is a right-hand thread. I just want to mark that because some of the newer Land Rovers have gone left-hand thread on the Jag engines. On these, on the 4.0 and the 4.6, this fan is a right-hand thread. So we have that off. We'll set that aside for a minute, and then what we're going to do now is we're going to remove this shroud. There's two 10mm head bolts. That'll take the shroud off. We'll remove the belt. We'll show you how to do that, and then at that point we'll show you how to drain the coolant on this. So next step is going to be removing the belt, and as I said earlier, what you want to do is pull out your cell phone, your camera, or whatever, if you're not really familiar, if this is the first time you've done this, to look at the routing on the belt, which runs under the damper, over the tensioner, or over the idler, around the tensioner, over the alternator, and then down and under the water pump pulley, up and over the AC pulley, behind another idler pulley, and then your power steering pump. So take a good picture of that, and then this way later on when you go to put everything together, you easily know where it's supposed to go. So to remove the belt, you have your tensioner on the passenger side here. It's a 15mm head bolt. You can go one of several routes. You could use a long ratchet with a 15mm socket. You can use belt tensioner. They sell these everywhere. This is a long extended bar with various tips on them to fit different vehicles, and you can use that as a tensioner. I prefer this. Been using this for years, and that just pops on there, and you're going to push down, which will lift the tensioner, slip the belt right off the bottom idler, and pop it right back off. And then you can take the belt off and set that aside. Alright, so the next step is going to be to drain the coolant out of this vehicle. Now you notice there is no drain plug on the bottom of the radiator. The factory tells you disconnect the lower hose, which means you're going to be standing under this when you let go. You really don't want to do that either. So what you can do, you can drain about 3/4 of the cooling system out just by taking this one bolt out of the water pump, and we're going to show you where that is. Alright, so there's the location of the bolt. This is the lower of the two 11mm bolts. You'll know that because the rest of the bolts that hold the water pump to the front cover are 10mm heads. And you can see this one, it looks like it had some slight leakage, so it's easy to see that it actually does attach to a coolant line. So once you take that out, that's drained about 3/4 of the coolant out of the block. Just don't forget to put a pan underneath to catch it. So next step now is going to be to remove this upper hose. Let's get this out of our way. What I did too is I gave a little pre-spray of some penetrating oil on the clamps. You'll notice that if you don't do that, they're a little dry, they come off hard. Shoot a little oil on them and everything comes off much easier. Now you have worm clamps on this particular connection, but at the other ends you have the squeeze clamps. Before you get this hose off, we're going to take the little bypass hose off. Take account if you have the original hose on there, these get kind of hard and brittle, so you want to flex it as little as possible. So I like to get this one up and out of the way because it also somewhat interferes with taking the air box and the intake tube out. We'll work that off and then basically just set this down in the front of the radiator so it's out of the way, less of a chance of breaking it. So then we're gonna take our squeeze clamp. Nice pair of water pumps, does a great job on these. So we'll take that off, and then we're gonna back off the one that's here at the thermostat. We'll just lift that off there. You know, then it's just a matter of squeeze and remove two ends, and then we'll take that clamp off and we'll get this right out of the way. There's something I'll mention in the course of taking the hose off, and sometimes when these hoses have been on for a long period of time, they really stick on there and they don't just twist off. So there's a handy tool you can get. You can buy these from any tool supplier. It's just nothing more than a sort of a bent pointer, and you can use that to get up underneath the hose and break it loose from wherever it's attached. You just work it around back and forth a little bit, and that separates it. And once you've done that, you get at least 3/4 of the way around, and you should be able to just spin that out and remove it. There we go. And now that hose is out. Now as you go through and you're disassembling the engine, this is a good time to be looking at different components that wear, that you may look ahead of time and say, okay, this is worn, I'm going to replace that as well. And this way you can get your parts together before you start your assembly. When you look at a hose and you look down inside, what you want to check are the corners on the inside. If you see vertical lines in there, then that's telling you that basically the hose is starting to wear on the inside and material is breaking down. That material eventually is going to end up in your radiator or your heater core and end up plugging it up. So any sign of real wear inside these hoses, you want to replace them. If you see any residue or buildup on the junction, that's telling you got a leak there. Same thing with down on the other ends of the hoses, wherever you can look down in and see corners, just look for lines and striations that indicate that the hoses are worn. This one actually internally looks pretty good. We'll probably end up reusing this one. Now we're going to remove the top of the air box and the intake tube. You have a worm gear clamp here, and you have what happens, these little pop clips here. And these, you just get up underneath with a pick and you're going to lift and it releases. Now I usually recommend, or I try to either put these clamps in my little plastic container or just reclamp them so that they stay on the hose, so when I go to reassemble I can find all my clamps. So then we unclip that. Again, we kind of pre-treated this clamp with a little penetrating oil so it spins off much easier. You just want to make sure that's good and loose. And then you have two clamps here that you just pop and lift back, and then your mass airflow sensor connector, you're just going to squeeze the top of it. You have two squeezing tabs on both sides, and most times you need a little screwdriver just to work it off a bit and move that out of the way. So set down there, twist that, pop that off. Now there's an O-ring inside this air box. You want to make sure, one, that it's there. I've had vehicles come in where that was missing, and also if it's expanded or if it's deteriorated and cracked, because you want to make sure you have a good seal between the two so you're not pulling in debris bypassing the air filter. So we'll set that aside just for a second. And we have a clamp here, and we have a clamp here, and then we just lift up the back side and we lift the top of the air box out. Now's a good time to take a look at your air filter. Yeah, I think we'll be replacing that one. So, now, if you want, and very easy to do, the bottom of the air box, which actually that area makes a nice shelf for when we go to take the AC compressor off. This is just a matter of lift until it pops. It just pops into plastic grommets. This would be harder in real cold weather, so keep that into account if you're working out in your driveway, especially now during the winter months. And then we're going to open that up a little bit. We have our cold air intake where it attaches to the fender. It's just two 10mm nuts. In fact, I think they're plastic. Yes, they're plastic. Once we get them off, make sure you put them in your little plastic container where you're keeping your hardware, and that just pops right out. And we lift that out, and now you see we have a nice area where we can put the AC compressor when we take it out. Also, again, nice little tip, you got two ground headers right here on this front firewall, and these are actually rather important. A lot of your sensors ground on these 2 points. While you got the box out, it would be a good idea to back them off, clean them up a little bit, and retighten them back up just to make sure you got a good ground. Alright, so as we mentioned, the AC compressor, we're going to set it here. To take the compressor off, we just have a single electrical connector right here. Push your tab. Sometimes they squeeze hard. There we go. You can actually hear it click when it releases. And then we have 4 10mm bolts, and this one in the back I usually just loosen up with a wrench because you really can't get a straight socket on it. As you can see, your throttle cable and your cruise control cable. Alright, so we have our 4 bolts out. We're going to leave that back one in. Obviously can't get it out anyway. We'll take a long bar. We're going to pop that loose because there are 2 locating dowels that will lock on these on a little bit. So what's great about this is, we're going to run that wire into there, that you don't have to disconnect your AC, so we don't have to worry about redoing it when we're done. And as you can see, we got a nice little holding area right there and keep it out of the way. Now that we have the belt off, now's a good time to be checking all your pulleys. We're going to do a little spin on the alternator, the tensioner. So, you know, this one is kind of stiff and grinding. We're going to definitely replace that pulley. They should essentially spin relatively free, a little bit of resistance, and definitely no grinding. And the power steering, you want to make sure you feel a little resistance there. And now's a good time to grab the water pump pulley and give it a little wiggle to see if we have any play. If you feel any loose play, now's the time to replace that water pump. So now what we're going to do, disconnect the battery, and we're going to remove this bracket, which is the mount for the AC compressor. We'll do that by taking these 3 bolts out here. You need to remove this pulley because there's a nut, retainer nut on the back side behind this that you're going to need to remove to take this off. There is a bolt on the side here holding the power steering hoses. We're going to take that off. We have this bolt right here. You got 3 long bolts that go through the bracket into the block. We'll remove those, and this whole aluminum assembly will come right up and out, and the power steering pump is just going to be left to the side. Alright, so as I was saying, this bracket's going to be coming out, and we're going to set this down. What's a good tip to do right now is find yourself a big piece of cardboard or a piece of masonite or whatever, and you're going to set it right down inside in front of that radiator. And essentially it's just to protect the radiator. So as we're moving brackets and bolts and heavier objects, you want to make sure that you don't slip and hit that radiator and end up now having to replace the radiator on top of your head gasket job. So it's a good tip, protects the radiator, save you a lot of money and grief if you don't. So before I take this off, I just want to show you, I've backed them out so you can tell. These are the bolts that you're going to remove. There's 2 here, which we had to remove the pulley here, which is nothing more than just 13mm head. Run the nut out, and the pulley and the nut and the bolt come right out. You have a bolt here, and then this was the nut that I was mentioning earlier. You take that off because that stud runs through from the head all the way through the power steering pump to the bracket. And once we take these 3 out, we can back this out. Now I noticed on this one, normally there's a bolt right here. More than likely that's what you're going to run into when you pull the AC compressor up. This one in particular was missing. We'll replace that when we put it back together, but look for a bolt here too that you're going to need to remove to take the bracket out. Take the bolts out, and then we're going to just take this bracket with the power steering lines and everything and set it right down in the hole, right up against the cardboard protecting our radiator, and that moves that out of the way without having to break open the power steering system or drain any fluid out of it. So now you see the bracket out of the way. You can see how much room you developed there. And now we're going to move over to the other side. We're going to simply, I've been taking a long-handled half-inch drive ratchet with a 13mm socket on it and use that to basically break loose the bolts. From there, most cases they'll come right out. You have a ground cable. We're going to disconnect this. There's going to be a 10mm head bolt on this bracket right here holding the cables in place. We're going to remove that. Take this bolt out to remove the belt tensioner, and we're going to take this bolt out to remove this lower pulley because we're going to replace this pulley anyway. This pulley is shot. And then once we run this bolt and this bolt out, what we'll need to do is take a pry bar to get the alternator out because we have what's basically an expanding socket in here so that when we tighten these bolts it locks everything down in place. And you'll see once I get it off, I'll explain it a little bit further. Alright, so now doing the passenger side bracket and the alternator and the cables and whatnot, I started a new little container here so I can throw the parts in. 2 things I'll note. The alternator bolts, because when we go to put this back together you want to be able to easily identify what went where. And normally what I do is, like with the tensioner and the pulley, I leave the bolt right in it, and I'll just stash that to the side. So this way I know there's two less bolts I need to identify. The bolts for the alternator, you'll notice, have a goldish tone because these are anodized. The rest of them you'll see are more of a silver color on the shaft, but the two bolts that go for the alternator have a gold tone, so they're easy to identify. And you want to be careful with this because when you're prying on the bottom side of this, you have these fins, so you don't want to put too much effort on that and break a fin. Get the top one broke loose. Get up underneath, and we lift, and then we get this forward enough so we can get to the hardware. Now we disconnected the battery because otherwise, if we didn't, this cable will be 12 volts hot, which means you touch this to ground anywhere, you're going to get a lot of sparks. So battery's disconnected, we're safe there. We got a 13 millimeter nut holding the cable on, and then a 10 millimeter nut for your field wire. And we're going to remove both of those, and we have the alternator out of the way. So next step is going to be the removal of this bracket, the alternator mount. We've already disconnected the 10 millimeter head bolt, so we've got this mount is disconnected. We have the cables disconnected, at least unhooked. And you'll notice now, before we can remove this bracket, we have another bracket off of this cooling tube right in front of it. So we're going to need to remove this cooling tube. And that's nothing more than 3 10 millimeter head bolts here, here, and then one underneath. We'll get that out of the way, and then I'll show you the 4 bolts you need to remove this bracket. Just to note, on the back side of this, where it attaches to the intake manifold, there is an O-ring. We want to make sure we get the old one out of there, and then you'll be getting a new one when you get your gasket set. So you can discard this, and I wouldn't reuse these anyway. Never reuse an old O-ring. So before I take them out, I just want to show you the locations of the 4 bolts that hold this bracket in. We have 1, 2, 3 right here, and 4 just below it and to the right. We take those 4 bolts out, and this mounting bracket comes right out. Now, what I had mentioned earlier, as far as the sliding studs that hold the alternator in, you can take a small hammer and tap what looks like a flat washer and open area. You'll tap these in a little bit because they're mounted on rubber. And you might want to even shoot a little penetrating oil on it before you do that. And then this way, when you go to put the alternator back in, you'll have a little bit of free space, and you won't have to try to hammer the alternator back in. It'll drop right in, put your bolts in, and when you tighten them up, it'll move this barrel so that it locks in against the alternator. Alright, so let's going to take that out of the way, and we'll have basically everything out of the front of the engine that we need to remove. So here's the bracket removed, and like we mentioned earlier, so that we don't basically lose track of what bolts go where, we'll just leave the bolts sitting right in their holes, and we'll set the bracket down to the side, and now there won't be any confusion as to what goes to this when you go to put it back together. So now that we've taken care of what's in the front of the motor, now we're going to start looking at and disassembling the top end. Next, we're obviously going to be the upper intake manifold. Now, I'm going to go through the basics as far as the stuff that's going to be common to both the vehicles not equipped as this is with secondary air, and then we'll also touch base on some of the additional items that you need to remove off of this if you do have an 03 to 04 with a 4.6 secondary air, or even the 4-liter with California emissions, they'll have secondary air. So to begin with, we're going to get the throttle cable out of the way, where we can just lift up, and that will pull up the throttle and open it. We'll turn this barrel, and there's a small opening right here that will allow you to snake the cable out. So we'll just hold that open, and we'll snake the front cable out the front, and we'll snake the back cable out the back. Then we're going to disconnect these 2 bolts right here, and then we can move both cables right out of the way. Next is going to be removing the 2 coolant hoses that go to the throttle body heater. Now you'll notice on this has got 2 regular clamps on them, what they call a worm gear clamp. Original equipment, it will be a squeeze clamp like we saw right here, and like we've disconnected up top, where we just put an awl underneath and we lift it and pop it. In this case, I'll need a Phillips screwdriver, and we'll take these 2 off. Be careful with this plastic hose. It becomes very brittle, just like we discussed on the one that runs across the top of the radiator. So when you go to move it over, just be a little careful on its movement. Try not to twist it or catch it on anything. So we're just going to back those clamps up, and we're going to pull those two hoses off. So throttle cable out of the way, we've got our two hoses disconnected. Next, what we're going to do is, this is the vacuum line that feeds your brake booster, and this has got nothing more than a quick disconnect. You'll see a little holding bracket right here. Matter of fact, you may want to take a picture of that so when you go to put this back together, you know which way it goes. So we'll pop that up, and that'll pivot on there. Now we're going to push in. You can take a pair of needle nose or a regular pair of pliers. You're going to hold that red cap in against the manifold and then pull the hose out. And that moves that out of the way. More than likely, there should be a clamp here or something to seal off. This is another vacuum line. Or actually, this is a breather hose. And we'll move that out of the way. And always check this little plastic nipple. These loosen up on quite a few vehicles, which can create a vacuum leak. Now's a good time before you take it off. Just snug it in, or you can take it off, put a little sealer on the thread, and run it back in. That would just take a 9/16 or 14 millimeter wrench on that, and that comes right out. That just threads in the manifold. So then, by doing this, it exposes this little bolt right here, which holds your two heater hoses onto the intake manifold, and then another down here, right underneath this tube. And we're going to take that out so that we can move this hose and this line right up out of the way. So we've taken the bolt out from below the heater hose line going into the intake manifold. We've taken the top bolt out, and we've moved that outer hose down and tucked it underneath the cruise control motor. That just holds it out of the way. The harness we've got sitting here we'll worry about later. Now at this point, this tucks into an O-ring into the manifold, and these usually will stick in there pretty good. So what you'll essentially need to do, give it a couple wraps to kind of loosen things up a little bit, and then we're going to take a straight blade screwdriver, and you can just get in behind that, and all we're going to do is just keep working that. And you may actually bend this bottom tab a little bit, and don't worry about that. You can just hammer it right back down. It's not going to do any real damage. As you say, like I said, these do stick in pretty good. And we'll just keep working it a little bit. And what you can do, if it's really got a tight one, you can back it out a little bit to create an opening, and we'll shoot some penetrating oil down in there. Let it sit about 5-10 minutes, and then this should pull right out. Alright, so now we're on the driver's side of the upper intake manifold, and basically the last things we need to take off of this one is going to be this breather hose right here. This will pull off the nipple. You have your throttle position sensor with your connector right here. Pop that connector out by just twisting this little tab and push down on the connector. That takes that out. And then we have the vacuum line that feeds the purge valve for the evaporative control. That has two squeeze buttons on this connector. You're going to squeeze on both sides. That will take that out. We can basically pop that out of its holder right here, and then we're going to disconnect that electrical connector, and this way we then can take this part of the harness and work it around to the other side of the vehicle. Now, I'm taking that vacuum line off of the purge for the purge valve. As I said, there's a button on each side of this connector, and they're a little difficult to get at. This is a tool that's made actually for removing plastic trim buttons and whatnot on trim and fender wells and whatnot. And I find simply by design, this grabs right around both sides, and you can push both buttons in and work that right off. It makes that job a lot easier. And you can actually use the same tool when we go to disconnect the fuel line off the back of the lower intake, and we'll get to that later. Now, next step is to remove the upper intake manifold. Now, on this vehicle, it's not equipped with secondary air, but you'll find, like on California models with secondary air and with 03 to 05, 03 and 04 4.6, that they also have secondary air. So what you'll be dealing with, there'll be actually a valve sitting on a Y tube sitting here and here, and it will be held in place by two studs with two 10mm nuts on the side of the upper intake. Now, I found that to make it easier on the removal, I've removed the nuts and then removed the studs that are left, and then what this will do is allow you to raise the upper intake without having to completely disassemble the diverter valves. Now, the valves sit on two corrugated pipes that are attached to two tubes that are threaded into the heads. And I found the best way on those is if you take a long punch and give the big nut at the base of that Y tube where it attaches to the adapter to the head. You give that a couple good sharp wraps, and generally they will just come right loose and come right out. Then you can take the valves out of the way. There'll also be a large vacuum harness that runs across the front and over to a control valve that would sit right about here. And then you also would have a sort of a oval egg-shaped black plastic container here that would also have 2 vacuum lines to it, and you would just disconnect that at this point, because now your alternator and your AC compressor are out and you can move that. And I just wanted to give you a brief rundown on that. I'm sorry we don't have one here to show you, but the explanation I just gave should give you a pretty good idea what you need to do. Now on this vehicle, and then also with the type with secondary air, once you've gotten the tubes and the valves out, you're just going to remove 4 10mm head bolts in the center, and there's another 10mm down in the back and another 10mm center front. There are also 2 small 8mm, if they're the original bolts, 2 small 8mm bolts that attach the top of the coil bracket to the upper intake, and you're just going to sneak down in there with an extension. What you can do is pop out the throttle cable to move that over, and then there are spring clips that hold this wiring harness in, which we can just take that out of there, and then by rolling this forward we can get straight in with an extension to get to those 2 back bolts. So that's what we're going to do now, and we're going to lift this upper intake out. So we have everything unbolted, so we're just going to pop this up. We're going to lift up a little bit so it clears there's actually a locating dowel about 3/4 of the way in under here. And we'll just work that back and forth. You're also going to have an electrical connector on the back side of the idle air control motor. You just squeeze, there's a little bar that runs across. You squeeze that and pull that connector off, and that should free you up. So we'll pull the upper intake off. So what you have remaining is the lower intake. We have the 8 electrical connectors to all the injectors, and then the ignition coil we're going to remove, and then we can access the fuel line down below. Now this coil has got a small 8mm head bolt here and then one here. And once you disconnect those, you can lift this up a little bit. And there's also an electrical connector on each side, which also has the little spring bar that you can press and release it from the coil. So that's the next thing we're going to do, is we're going to disconnect all the spark plug wires off the spark plugs on both sides, disconnect and remove the 2 bolts, lift this up, take the 2 connectors out, and then we can take the ignition coil and the wires out one assembly. Now on this particular vehicle, and actually on some of the original equipment, the gray wires, the number of the cylinder is numbered right on the wires. Before you start pulling these off, make sure yours are numbered. If they aren't, tag them so that when you go to put this back together, you'd end up putting them back in the right sequence. Alright, then what I've done, and this trick works really nice, your 2 air conditioning lines in the back. This is very bendable, very malleable metal. They're generally a high tensile aluminum. So we're just going to actually pop them back just a little bit. You can use a piece of wood. What this does essentially, it gives us just enough clearance to sneak that coil out of there, because it is pretty tight fit. The other way you could do is to unbolt the lower intake and slide it forward a little bit and slide this out, but I'm just used to doing it this way, and it works. And we disconnected the 2 wires off the side, and we're just going to lift that right up and out of there. Let's pull the wires through. If you've tagged your wires, just be careful not to pull your tags off. So just to show you here, here's our electrical connector on one side. You see the little metal bar across the top. You're just going to press down on that until you hear it click, and that pops right off. And we'll do the same to the other, and we lift the coil right up and out of there. And what we're going to do now is then we're going to disconnect the electrical connections to the injectors, and we should be able to move this engine harness right up and out of the way. So now we're down to the lower intake, which is going to be nothing more than 13mm head bolts all the way down the line. We got 2, 4, 6, and then 6 on the other side. We've popped off the injector wiring and just kind of moved everything out of the way, which really opens up the work area. It gives you plenty of room to work. We're going to take all those bolts out, break the lower intake loose because they stick on pretty well, and move it forward maybe about an inch or so we can reach down in the back, and we're going to disconnect the fuel line and we can have that lower intake out. We're at the point now we've got this all unbolted, and as I say, these stick, and these stick pretty good. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a flat blade screwdriver. You can use a hard scraper or whatnot. We're going to get down at an angle from here, and the reason we don't want to start here or hit into this because we have a water jacket right here on the intake manifold. We definitely don't want to cut any gouges or create any depressions where the gasket's going to have a hard time sealing. So we're just going to run this straight down. We'll just work it so we can get in between the manifold and the head. These do stick. Run that forward a little bit. So now we're going to reach in the back, and all we need to do now is just disconnect that fuel line in the back, and we can pull this right up and out. Alright, so down in the back behind the lower intake, you can see the fuel line comes up and then goes to this connector right here. And this is going to be similar to that solenoid that we disconnected earlier. You get a little push button right here, and then there's one identical to it on the other side. You just reach down, squeeze those two tabs in. Usually works better if you grab the connector, push into the tube, squeeze the two buttons, and it should come right out. Alright, next step is going to be removing the valve covers. Now on the valve covers, you've got 4 bolts, and they are 8mm 12 point. So you're going to need an 8mm or a 5/16 12 point socket, preferably 1/4 inch drive, so that'll fit down that little well that they put the bolts into. And I sort of have a long swivel, which works really well. And you're going to just remove the 4 bolts and give it a tap. Now on the driver's side, you have a small Phillips head screw that holds the dipstick onto the valve cover. Now once you take the screw out, I found that if you use a carburetor cleaner or a varnish remover and you just squirt some down on the bottom of this, you're going to let it sit for a minute, and you should be able to work that right up and out of the block and get it out of your way. So we're going to take the driver's side off first. And once we take the 2 bolts out on the inner, then we're going to take a short stubby Phillips. We'll take that little screw out that's right on the side here, and then we'll take the 2 bottom bolts out and lift this valve cover right out. So we'll move the harness out of the way. We've taken the 4 bolts out. We took the screw out of the dipstick, and we're just going to lift this up and out of the way. Throw the old gasket away. And you can see in here, we've definitely have had some coolant and oil mix in there. That's what that milky color is. So we're on the right track, working our way down to the heads, and we're going to see what those gaskets look like when we get them apart. Another good thing to do is take a quick look up top, see the condition of the rockers, see if anything is odd or out of place. Looks good, just needs to be cleaned off. And that's the other thing too, is if you have the opportunity, I don't know what facilities you have, but if you have a local engine shop or whatnot, it would be a good idea, even if you don't have the parts reworked, at least have them hot tanked, cleaned off. This way all the gasket surfaces are clean, the upper surfaces are clean, and just generally will look a lot better too when you get it done. So we're going to move this out of the way. And like I said with the dipstick, fortunately this one, nice and loose. You just grab the little bracket and just work that back and forth. And pull that right up and out of the block, and we'll move that out of the way. Next step is now we're going to take the rocker arms off. Now remember that you're going to have spring pressure on some of these because of the valve and the cam positioning. So when you back these 4 bolts off, you have 1, 2, 3, and 4. You're going to back them off just a little bit at a time. Start from the middle, work your way outward, and then just back it out. If you end up taking one out completely and then the other, it can cause a twist, and I've even seen it where it snapped the rocker shaft and because it created too much tension. So we're going to take these out a little bit at a time. We're going to do both sides. Take the push rods out. Now usually it's recommended that you're going to want to put the push rod back in the same position it was in when you go to put the engine back together, because not the way the push rod seats in the rocker, they're not going to be identical all the way down the line. There's going to be a little bit different wear on it, and sometimes that can create a little noise in the engine. So when you take the push rods out, number them or mark them with a piece of tape or whatever, so when you go to put it back together, they go back in the same way. So we've taken our rockers off, we've pulled the push rods, marked all your push rods. You'll probably feel that when you pull them up, you yanked a couple of the lifters out, which is fine, because the next step is going to be pulling the intake gasket out, and it's just a matter of this bolt right here and another one identical in the back, 1/2 inch socket. Zip those out. We're going to take these two top lockdowns off, and then with a scraper we can just work our way around and lift the whole pan assembly right up and out. And then at that point we'll be ready to take the heads off. So we're just going to zip this off. Alright, so then I'm just going to take a scraper and lift this up. Now, and note, the two bolts that you took out of this, the one in the front and the back, has a different thread than any of the other bolts in this engine. They went with a 5/16 coarse thread bolt. So you want to make sure that you either mark them or keep them separate, or just that you understand by looking at them that you're going to have to use those two same bolts in this position. You can't use them anywhere else in the engine. So just on that note, we'll get this scraped up and lift a little bit, and we can pull this right up and out of here. And you'll see a couple of lifters popped out, which is fine because we're actually we'll set them back in place. If you're going to continue on after removing the heads to strip the block down, probably wouldn't be a bad idea to replace the lifters, in which case you want to take the new ones and soak them in a tub of oil before you put them back in, just to get them filled with oil. Okay, so everything back there, and we take our intake and we get rid of this. We're not going to reuse it. So the next step is to remove the heads. Now you got two approaches that we can do on this. You can either disconnect the catalytic converters from the exhaust manifolds, and once you take the head bolts out, take the head and the manifold out, one pull, or you could take the bolts out that attach the manifold to the head, remove the head, leaving the exhaust manifolds in place. Probably a matter of what's more convenient for you as far as how to access it. Being I have a lift, I can get to the 6 bolts underneath relatively easy. If you're doing this on the floor, then you may want to remove the exhaust manifold bolts. Now the exhaust manifold bolts are a 12mm 12 point, so you want to make sure you have that style socket before you go taking this off. Now, two things to look at before you take the heads off, or before we even begin with the head bolts, is there's a 13mm head bolt in the back that in some cases early Bosch will have no ground wire there, but they will have the harness. You can see that loop right there. There was a bolt went through that into the head to hold the harness in place, and then straight down in the back of the left side head is the connector for the crankshaft speed sensor, and that is going to be kind of inaccessible. You're going to have to take a long screwdriver. You need to pop it out of a bracket, that just simply a forked bracket that holds that connector, and you get in with a long screwdriver and I just pop that out of there. Sometimes you can even, if you're going to pull just the head and leave the exhaust, you can break it loose, move it forward just a little bit. We'll give you a little bit better access. But it's in a crazy place. It's hard to get at, but just so you know it's there. So what we're going to do is now we're going to grab a breaker bar and a 5/8 or 16mm socket. We're going to break all these head bolts loose, and then I'm going to put this up in the air and take the 6 bolts off the exhaust manifolds. Alright, so as I said, what we're going to do is we're going to disconnect. There's 3 nuts on each side that'll disconnect the exhaust manifold from the catalytic converters. This is the way I prefer to take it off. Like I said, you can do it from up top. It's a little bit harder, but if you don't have easy access underneath the vehicle, then yes, it'll be easier for you. So what we're going to do is they're 1/2 inch. You got 3 nuts on each side. These actually look relatively clean. We're going to take those 3 off, drop the vehicle back down, and then we'll get the bolts out of the heads and then lift the heads right off the engine. Alright, so as I mentioned before, we've taken the 6 bolts out from underneath. Now just a note, a lot of times because they've been down there and a number of these vehicles have been around for a while, they will rust in place. You may try to heat them up to take them out. Some of them may snap the stud in the manifold, which it did in this case in a couple places. If you're in a shop, that's fine, because when you pull the heads, the manifolds are coming with it. You'll have easy access to either drilling or blowing out with a torch. If you don't have those facilities, you can always just take the manifold off the head, take it to a shop, have them put new studs in it. The studs are available on these. So the next step is going to be, now that we've got the bolt out of the back, the connector for the crank position sensor out of the back, now it's just a matter of, there's 10 head bolts. Now when you take them out, you're going to notice the top 3 center are going to be longer than the rest. Take that in note when you go to put the new ones in. And once we get the bolts out, we'll show you a little trick on how to lift that up and out of there. Alright, so when you're taking the head off, one thing I wanted to mention there also, that there's a braided ground strap right here. This runs down and bolts to the back of the head. You have a 10mm nut here. You only need to take that nut out and you'll take the strap out with the head. Also, this is the time when you're going to use that 5/8 universal socket. This is the one that you're going to need to get to that back bolt in this back corner. Otherwise, this is really tough to get at. And it's nice because the universal design limits the twist on it, so you're not fighting against yourself trying to get it out of there. So this is the point where you're going to use this tool, and you really only need it just for that one bolt. The rest of them will come out with a straight bolt, with a straight socket. Now we've got all the head bolts out. We've got the lower 3 bolts out. We're going to show you a little trick on pulling the head, because you're probably wondering, okay, now we've got the manifold and the head together, have a fair amount of weight. They're really not that bad. So what we're going to do is we're going to reinstall the rocker shaft without the push rods, because then we don't have to deal against any spring pressure or whatnot. And we don't even need to put the bolts in all the way, just about halfway, enough to support the weight without doing any damage to any of the threads. And I would suggest do all 4. Don't just do the inners or the outers. This way it'll distribute the weight a little bit better. Alright, so the trick is we're going to take 2 shop rags. Now that we've put the rocker back in place, we put the bolts in about halfway, and we'll tuck a couple shop rags just underneath the rail. Alright, so we're ready to pull this out. And what we've done is we've taken 2 shop rags and tucked them underneath the rail so that you have a handle. You say we've run these bolts in about halfway. It doesn't take, it's not a lot of weight, but it just makes it easier. And then what we're going to do is just lift straight up and take the head right out. Alright, so at this point we got the head out. Just to show you, here was that connector for the crank position sensor that you can see is kind of in a very hidden spot. And you'll notice that prior to that we've got all the wiring up out of the way. So now's a good time to give the gasket an inspection to see if this was your culprit. You can slowly peel this off. You can see we've had a little bit of blow by between the cylinders. This may be the possibility of a cracked piston. We'll have to clean that all off before we can make a determination. It could just be water stain. So we'll move our gasket up and out of the way. And then now we're going to do the same thing with the head on the other side. Get both heads off. And then we're going to do an inspection to see if we have a slip sleeve, which these engines are notorious for. It's an aluminum block with a steel sleeve that is not pinned or fastened down in any way, shape, or form from the manufacturer. So there are times where they can get hot and the sleeves will move a little bit, or the block can crack underneath the sleeve, which you'll see traces of coolant. So we're going to go through a basic inspection on that, and we'll show you how to do that. So we're at the point now we want to do our cleanup before reassembly, and this is actually as critical as doing prep work for a good paint job. You want to make sure you got everything clean, you've done your inspection to see exactly what your cause was, why you pulled the heads to begin with. And what we found was, of course, the back of by number 8 cylinder, the head gasket in this area between this coolant galley and the cylinder was drawing in coolant. You can see how basically it steam cleans the cylinder as opposed to the buildup and whatnot you have in the other combustion chambers. So what we're going to do is we'll give you a few tips on how to clean this up. Usually if they're like really loaded up with grease and oil and whatnot, you get some engine degreaser and a pressure washer, you get it cleaned off. You can see this has reached a level where that's acceptable to put back on. We've taken the spark plugs out, we have all the gasket surfaces out, and essentially at this point all you really need to do is get all the gasket surfaces clean and dry so that the new gaskets have a good surface to adhere to. So what I normally like to do is I'll take a small scraper and whatnot. Now this is aluminum, so we're not going to dig. We're just going to basically ride the scraper over the top and just get the heavy stuff off. And we'll do that all the way around until we get it all out. We're going to keep this at a good low angle so that we're not digging into the aluminum at any point. And then you'll do the same thing on your intake gasket area here. Now remember, these are your intake ports. These are coolant. You definitely don't want to dig into the aluminum there. And then on your exhaust side, same thing. You're going to scrape off the heavy area and buzz that off. Again, it's good to have the spark plugs out because we're going to clean those holes out as well. And then the next step would be, you can take a small brass, and I recommend brass, not steel, especially an aluminum head, and we'll just work our way around in the combustion chamber, clean off the top of the valves. You see it takes it off pretty easily. And we'll get around up in there. And then the last step is what I can do is, you can do one of two things if you don't have air power, where I use a little angle head die grinder with the 3M, what we refer to as a cookie, and we'll end up buzzing all this off. Now, this is basically an example, but on an aluminum head, you would use a blue cookie. They actually are made in several different coarseness, and the blue is the very fine, which is all you need to just basically take the surface down nice and clean. If you don't have the air power, you can actually go out and buy a pad of Scotch-Brite. Again, this is the very fine, so this is what you want to use on aluminum, and we'll use that to clean up the surface. And then what do is, if you don't have the tool, you can take it to a small machine shop or whatnot. This is essentially an engine straight edge, and this is actually an edge that is accurate to a 1/2 thousandth of an inch. And what you'll do is, you're going to place it in different angles on the head, and then with a flashlight on the back side, you're going to look to see if any light is visible through the back side. This is going to tell you have some warpage, and you can tell how much by just sliding a feeler gauge in there until it's nice and snug. But this is what we're going to use to basically test all the surfaces on both the head and the block, and the preparation for the top of the block is going to be the same as this. We're just going to lightly scrape off the heavy stuff and then take the rest down with a 3M. The other thing you want to watch on the cylinder heads, here and here, these are your oil galleys that feed oil up to the rocker assemblies. So you want to take a pipe cleaner or a small drill bit or whatever and just run it through there, and you're going to find there's usually gunk built up in there. You want to make sure these are clean. The same on the block, you have these two galleys lined up in the same area. Same thing, you can run a small drill down through it or a pipe cleaner just to get the gunk cleaned out of it. Dipped in mineral spirits does a really nice job cleaning it out. And the mineral spirits do no harm when you eventually start the vehicle up. There's so little in there, mix right in with the oil. It doesn't cause a problem. Okay, so essentially that's the rundown on cleaning up the head. And I'll show you a finished product just to give you an idea how you should look before you put it back together. That's right, so there you are. You see basically your combustion chambers. We got all the heavy stuff cleaned out. Your gasket surface is nice and clean. There's your intake surface, again, nice and clean. We've put the straight edge on all of this, and we determined that the heads are in good shape. Same thing on the exhaust. And we have a nice clean gasket. Now you'll notice when you took the exhaust manifolds off, some of the areas you're going to find they double gasketed from the factory. So take note of that, where those double gaskets were, because on some cases you may need to do that, because the heads are nice and straight, but the exhaust manifolds, they're not built to the thousandths of an inch. So sometimes one area is a little less pressure here to create a seal, so they double gasket to make up for that. So just keep that in mind. Other than that, this head, and once we get that one done, these heads will be ready to put back on the engine.